Welcome back, everybody, to the Thrivestry podcast, mastering the art of thriving at life, where we talk about creating change in our lives and in the world around us. I'm your host, JJ, and this is my co-host, Gigi. Say hi, Gigi.
Hi.
And we are wearing our shades because the sun is out. We're indoors right now, but the sun is out, so I'm being prepared. Actually, I just got back from a little workout and a little walk outside. It was pretty awesome, and so we were both wearing our sunglasses, so we figured we'd do the intro with our sunglasses, but I'm going to put them up here now. So Gigi wanted to wear them the entire time. I don't know. You can wear your.
Did I? Talk about that? I don't remember having that conversation, but I do like my sunglasses. That's true.
So today we're actually going to talk about coaches and mentors, and kind of related to the medical system and doctors, and how there's a big disconnect between how often we see the doctors and the results that we need from a health standpoint, a life standpoint. And then we're also going to go over this study that came out this week about how cartilage is rebuilt in the joints. And so it was a pretty interesting study that they did. And it was really important for us as coaches to educate people that, that movement is the key to actually building new cartilage and maintaining the cartilage that you have. So when people talk about like, oh, I don't have any cartilage in my knee and my doctor told me this, and it's like, well, yeah, if you don't use that limb, you don't use that joint, you are going to see cartilage deterioration. And so, what are the ways that we can make sure that we don't have that, so we can keep functional use of our body into our, 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? So Gigi this is a really good point that she brought up around, again, kind of habits and motivation, and you hear me talk about all these things and accountability. And there's a big disconnect when it comes to the medical system. And, you can't really call it the health care. It's more like the sick care, and one of the things that we see time and time again is that these doctors, most people don't go to see them until it's broken. Again, it's like not taking your car in for regular maintenance, like oil changes and your tires and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden you have a major problem, and then you have your car towed to the mechanic. And the reality is that doctors are mechanics. They're experts in fixing things that are broken. And, they're not experts at helping maintain, something that's going really well, like a healthy person, right? So they're not necessarily, some of them are, but in general, they have to focus on fixing all the broken stuff. And so they're not necessarily experts in nutrition or fitness or anything like that. And so it's important to understand that difference, let alone the infrequency. Even if you went to the doctor every year, it's not going to be the same as talking to a coach or a mentor once a month or every couple of weeks, or having somebody that you could reach out to in a moment's notice and get an answer immediately. And I think that was a really good point that Gigi was making.
Well, what was the analogy that you said offline? It was the mechanic analogy. You said mechanics are there to fix broken cars, not to drive cars, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're driving your own body, it's your responsibility to not slam the brakes on and put clean oil in it, and use the right kind of gas and all that kind of stuff. And one of my very first experience with personal training was when I was a student, and my personal trainer said to me, you wouldn't put shitty oil in your car, so why would you put crappy food in your body? And I was like mind blown, I was like, oh my God, that is so true. As she's eating like handfuls of almonds, almonds and cucumbers, that was her thing. I don't know, but
that was an interesting combo. Yeah, that quote I think originally was I heard it from Mark Ripito, and it was, like another analogy. I think it was like another car analogy. Was things like, there's a difference between being a race car driver and being a cab driver in downtown New York. They're both driving, but they're very different skills. And, people talk about bulking and stuff, and they say like, lifting weights because you're worried you're going to get too bulky is like worried about driving too much because all of a sudden you're going to become a race car driver. Like they're very different skill sets and in extremes. And I think the analogy for the mechanic and the doctor do apply, like I said, because the medical system is focused more on this, when people are broken. Now I know at least in our area, there's been a big push in marketing wise for prevention, right? And so there's a lot more like lifestyle things they're recommending, and insurance companies here in the US are trying to figure out ways to help people live healthier lifestyles. One of the fastest growing life insurance companies I think it's called Health IQ or something like that. Not a sponsored video, not a sponsored podcast, but they're like one of the fastest growing ones. And they're the ones you've probably seen the ads if you're a fitness buff like we are, that say things like, if you can run a mile in under 9 minutes, you can get a discount on your life insurance. If you can bench press your body weight, if you can do 10 pull-ups, or it has these, and there's basically these tests that you do, because what they know is that people who take care of their fitness live longer, so it's a better investment for them, right? There's lower instances of all-cause mortality when people are taking care of themselves. And could it, is it that, like we talked about that push-up test that the firefighters did in one of the previous podcasts, and is it that push-ups prevent you from having heart attacks? No, it's just that people who tend to keep up with their fitness and can do push-ups tend to be overall more healthy. There's a correlation there, not causational necessarily. And
the problem with a doctor, sorry, can I say something?
Yeah.
May I? I should put up my hand.
Yeah.
The problem with the doctor is that they only analyze the range of normal, right? So we know that someone who can do 30 push-ups is healthier than someone who can do 2 push-ups, right? But for a doctor, all they're looking at is how overweight are you, right? Like they're not looking at that range of fitness as well. Their only concern is whether or not you pass the minimum to not be declared sick, right? So someone who's a smoker, I used to use this example all the time when I owned a gym. Someone who's a smoker who smokes a pack a day, but doesn't have cardiovascular disease or lung cancer or something like that, they're not going to define as sick. That they're going to be sick, and that they can't run, they're not sleeping properly. There's a lot of things that are probably wrong with them in terms of their optimal health, but they don't meet the definition for sickness.
Yeah, and if you can imagine, there's a 0 point, which is kind of like your bare minimum. You're not healthy, but you're not ill. And usually when they're seeing people that are in the negatives, right? So they're in the negative numbers, they're -1, -10, and they're just trying to get you back to 0. And this is true for a lot of physical therapy too. And they're just trying to get you back to 0, maybe to a 1 on the positive side, but they're not really there to take you, to a 10 or a 20 on the positive side. But like I said, there are specialists, who do that. And I think that's why a lot of us in gyms and a lot of us kind of in that CrossFit world tend to gravitate toward the performance side, because at least we know that when you're chasing performance, whether it's in a sport or the sport of fitness or whatever, or even just in your daily workouts, if you're trying to improve your scores, at least we're moving you toward farther down that. There's this thing that CrossFit talks about, the spectrum, right? There's sickness, wellness, and then fitness. And the whole idea is if you chase fitness, then you'll become well, and eventually you'll become fit. And I do think that's a really simplified way of looking at it, because you can actually take fitness too far, and it can have negative health benefits as well. But in general, moving toward performing better, moving better is always going to move you away from sickness. And then that way, if you do, have some sort of injury or setback, you have you're in a better place to start. So like if you have a double body weight deadlift, if you're less likely to throw your back out in your daily life anyway. And then if you do, you're probably going to recover faster, because your body had to build these structures and compensate to be able to do that, right? So you're less likely to be sidelined for months or years because you were starting at such a high point to begin with.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I've got 2 things on that. So the first thing is that people are kind of like, well, I don't want to be ripped, and I don't want to lift weights because I don't want to get bulky. And, someone might say, I don't want to be 20 or 50 or 100 on the fitness scale. I just want to not be sick. But the reality is that life will always happen, right? So life gets in the way. You're going to, for me, you're going to have a baby. You're going to go through stressful times in your life. You're going to go through times where it's not easy to get to the gym. So you kind of have to take advantage of those times where everything is in your favor and be as healthy as possible during those times, because when life happens, you'll be able to kind of not degrade into sickness, right? So many people, they sit on that line, right? Like that line between sickness and fitness.
As soon as they get back to a 1 or a 2, they just go back to what they were doing.
Right. But then what happens is that, maybe they're stuck inside for a few weeks and they get sick because their immune system isn't super strong. They're just not sick, right? Do you know what I mean? So then they're immediately back into that sickness kind of world, right? Or somebody passes away and they have to take a month or two off when they're grieving to get, sort through their stuff or whatever. And then they fall into the sickness realm. That's when people get injured or mental illness creeps in or stuff like that, because they're not looking after themselves as well as they could in the opportunities that they have it. And then the other thing that you were saying about the sickness, wellness, fitness continuum that CrossFit uses, about how like you can, there's also degradation on the fitness side as well. We used to actually use the sickness, wellness, fitness competitor loop. So if you can imagine, I'm obviously doing a lot of hand motions now if you're listening on the podcast, but
I have another loop graphic I could create.
Oh, you're so good with those. I fucking hate doing that stuff. So the sickness, wellness, fitness continuum is like an arch, right? So the sickness is at the apex, and then wellness and sickness are on opposite sides, parallel, kind of at zero. And then the competition side is opposite from wellness, right? So basically the idea is that as you're going through the process, you kind of hit this optimal fitness point, but then you can go past it where you're overtraining, and that's where elite athletes live. So they kind of live in this place where they're risking themselves. And you hear about like NHL players getting injured and runners that tear their hamstrings in the middle of a race between Canada and US to see who is going to be the fastest, stuff like that. Right. So, but that's where athletes are kind of paid to live. Right. But the everyday humans should live on that kind of the space between wellness and fitness. Right?
Yes. And it becomes not only does it become diminishing returns, so you keep investing more time and energy to become more and more fit and a little bit more competitive. Eventually you start to break down and to be truly competitive. Now, if you're just doing the fun weekend comps locally and you're doing the open every year, like you're probably okay. But again, people who commit to try to make this a career or really spend a few years to see how good they can be, they're trading in, they're walking that fine line, and they're trading in some potential, pain and injuries down the road, for their bodies if they're really pushing it as hard as they can. Now, can you intelligently train? It depends on the sport that you're training for, but you can intelligently train so that you can do it for decades and have the minimal amount of risk of injury. But in a lot of these really competitive sports, if all of your compatriots are pushing the line of how fast they can make progress and how good they can get as fast as they can, you won't, it might be 10 years until you're really competitive, right? As they start to fall off due to injuries and that sort of thing, it's really the long game to try to do that. But you're going to hang out in that fitness competitive realm longer because you're not going to get hurt. And then, but again, if you really want to just commit your life to it for a few years, that style is probably isn't going to pay off. We do see a lot of burnout too, people competing. But let's going back to the coach doctor thing. So then what I found works best is, this coach for life model we talk a lot about, and Mad Lab and just in general, people should have a person that, not that they see once a year when, just to make sure, just to go over a few complaints, or they only see the person when they have a major issue, but they should actually go, have a person that they can call right away or text when they have a question, or someone that's checking in with them once a month to make sure that they're following through on the things that they're supposed to be doing. But even more importantly, I think a lot of us, everybody does this, is, we're being inundated by all this information. And we want to make change and we want to do something. So then, there's a new ad or a new keto diet, or we're going to do this other thing. And you're like, oh, I want to lose weight. And people say, this is what I should do. And so then you start chasing down all these different things to try to get the results that you want. But the purpose of an expert, like a coach, is, you only have so much time and energy to give to something new. And if you spend it on the wrong thing, you're just wasting your time. Right. Or it could be detrimental to your real goals. And having somebody, working that OODA loop to sit down, and say, okay, this is what you should be spending your time and energy on to get the most benefit from your efforts versus just sort of like, I don't know, this thing seems cool now, my friend told me about this other diet, or my friend told me that this worked for them, so now I'm going to try it. And it's funny how people will do the most weird stuff because their friend or their friend of a friend said pickle juice was where it was, and you got to drink pickle juice and you'll lose weight or whatever, and instead of talking to an expert that actually is up to date on all this stuff and knows you, again, you're oriented, you're observe, orient, they know you, they know where you're at. And then to decide, they can help you decide what's going to give you the best return on investment. And I think that's really where coaches can benefit you guys.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up the pickle juice thing, but because I've never heard that one, but there's a lot of cayenne pepper or lemon juice, or, it's the quick fixes. I think that a juice cleanse is like one of the most
common, and the weight loss.
Right? Yeah.
Well, and even like the fasting and paleo and vegetarian, vegan, it's there's all these things. And to back it out even further, the reality is, you guys, is that every person really is a unique human being, right? And so it depends on your lifestyle and your psychology and your gut health and your genetics, and all these things come into play. Now, there are general principles that apply to everybody, like if you're trying to lose fat, you need to eat less calories than you're burning. But there's a lot of different moving parts within that can change. And they can also be, you could just eat less, but that could be really hard for you. But if your coach says, well, actually, here's how you can eat a little bit less and not be hungry. And then here's how you can burn a little more calories and not feel drained or take up a lot of time. And then your mind gets blown, because it's so much easier than you thought when someone tells you exactly what to do for your life, and so everyone should experiment. Everyone should always be trying. You should always be trying new things. Again, it's best if you work with an expert, but when you hear all these people ranting about how great this thing is, you have to always remember that, yeah, you're probably only hearing about the people it worked exceptionally well for. You're not necessarily going to hear all the people who tried it and failed, right? They may not speak up and say, they tried it for a few weeks, or they tried it, it didn't work, or you might hear some negative things if some really bad happened. But, like with the keto thing, I think most people, they'll try keto, but they don't really do it very well. They don't really understand how to do it correctly, where you're supposed to actually eat vegetables. And there's a real extreme part of keto where they say, oh, if you eat too much protein, it'll knock you out of ketosis. And that's everything I've seen. That's not true. Like, you still need to eat like 100 grams of protein a day. And these people are trying to eat like 20 grams of protein. And then they're, oh, you can eat all you want. And it's like, well, no, you can't. It still comes down to that calorie equation. But you only really hear about all the success that people have had, and that works for their genetics, their lifestyle, their gut biome. Keto works for them. And so you might think, oh, but you won't really know until you try, right? And, somebody who knows you, who's been working with you, could say, you know what, I don't think that's going to be the best for you. You seem to run a little bit better with some carbs, but we can do an experiment and try it and see if it works for you. And then okay, it didn't work. And you also need to make sure that you did it right. You're not just like you read a blog post and that's what you're basing all your experience on.
Well, it's that we were talking about this in the podcast, the previous one to this one, right? Was when we talked about the OODA loop, right? And that's the observe, orient, decide, act, which, by the way, I've used like 20 times since we recorded that podcast. I think it's great. And that's what your coach should really be doing with you, right? Is bringing you through this decision-making process and the experimental process, and learning about you and your body, especially like as you age and go through things, your body's requirements and needs will change also. So to have, what worked for you 5 years ago won't work for you forever. And to kind of have that person in your corner who can work through that with you as you go through these changes, that's educated to do that, is more than anything. It's fantastic. Anyway, what's our article for this week?
So our article was, let me see if I can bring up the share here. It's an awesome X-ray of a knee, I believe. And so the article is exercise helps prevent cartilage damage caused by arthritis. And so they were specifically looking at arthritis, osteoarthritis, because that was kind of what the journal it was published in and everything. And, it's really funny. Even somebody who's been living this for so long, it cracks me up when they find a new thing about the body that we never knew. Like I remember, I was probably 5 or 6 years ago now, where they found a new ligament in the knee. And it's like, oh, how many millions of people, cadavers have they gone through and then dissected, and like how many hundreds of years have we been looking at our bodies, and maybe thousands of years, and we didn't even know this body part existed. Even like the whole science around the fascia, which is this skin that covers all of our muscles and a lot of our soft tissues, is really fascinating, because for the longest time, the first doctors were always just cutting through it to get to the muscles, to get to the internal structures, and they never really thought too hard about what is this skin, this fascia that covers it. And we know that it's really important for movement, and it's like a critical, well, I mean, all of our body parts are pretty critical, but it plays a much larger role than anybody realized. And a lot of that research is what's been driving kind of the mobility surgeons that we've seen, and a lot of those techniques and styles for tissue manipulation. So they basically, I'm sure there was some theories around this, but basically the way your cartilage works, you can rebuild cartilage, and you can prevent cartilage degradation through movement. And there's basically microscopic, I think they said there was like 1,000th of a millimeter cilia, which are little string-like, hair-like structures that are on the cartilage, and through mechanical motion, it sends a signal. Those cilia get squished, and it releases this HDAC6 protein, which actually prevents inflammation, right? So that inflammation that we see, especially in osteoarthritis, is driven, prevents new growth of cartilage, and also causes some degradation. And so it was really interesting that they say, like, movement is what that, here it is, 1,000th of a millimeter is how big they are. But so I thought it was pretty interesting. And again, it's something that we all know, that people who are active can stay active longer, right? Like, if you stop moving, you start to have sore knees, and your elbows hurt, and your joints start to hurt, and you need a hip replacement and all these things, because you're not using it. If you don't use it, you'll lose it, right?
Yes. Good line.
I just realized I was ranting there for a few minutes.
You weren't ranting, you were summarizing the article.
Summarizing the article. Yeah, that sounds good. So as coaches, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, the important thing that we need to educate everyone about is that, again, one of the reasons why full range of motion is so important when we're doing these exercises is, you think about something like squats. And if people aren't working, like if they have poor mobility, and their knee hurts when they squat or whatever, and you haven't solved that, and so your solution is to just squat to a box forever, right? And you're not doing the full range of motion, or you don't go all the way down. Well, then, if you're not flexing that knee past 90 degrees, for example, you're not actually going to engage all the cilia through the cartilage in the knee, and eventually the cartilage that's supposed to be there will become degraded, and then they will permanently lose that ability to operate that joint. And so you think, okay, well, maybe not in all metcons or workouts do you need to worry about that. But again, that's where we get the bulk of our movement. So if you have a workout that has 20 wall balls for 5 rounds, that's 100 reps, and you're not going all the way down, that's 100 repetitions where some of your cartilage is getting operated, but not all of it. And then you extrapolate that over the weeks, months, and all of a sudden they can't go lower. It's really bad for them to go lower. And so I think, one of the things I do when I program, I'm always paying attention to the volume of those movement patterns day to day and week to week, to make sure we're not doing too many reps of any particular movement, but we're getting enough to where we get the stimulus to get stronger and grow. And so especially with our older people, and people will always come in and say, well, I got this bad whatever. And it's like, the reality is the reason why your shoulder is bad is because you injured it, you stopped using it for a while, and then you never restored the range of motion, and you never tried to get back beyond zero. You just got back to zero. You're pain-free for the most part, but you don't have the full range of motion. And if you don't have the full range of motion, it's only going to continue to get worse over time. And again, you may hit a point of no return at some point, but making sure that people, if they can't do any sort of like snatching overhead movement, it's not like you should just say, you know what, you're never going to do snatches ever again. Some people, there may be a reason for that. It's case by case basis, but in general, if they don't have any real issues, that it's just they have tight shoulders, it's like, no, we need to be constantly trying to get them to get that range of motion so that they can maintain healthy shoulders the rest of their life, instead of just cutting out a movement completely. Now, am I a fan of programming squat snatches and metcons? Not at all. I really try to limit those. If they do show up, they tend to be very light or a scale up. And it's always okay to do a power snatch to overhead squat, and that would still count, as a rep, if you will. But I think there's a lot of times people try to dumb down the programming because they're saying, well, like everyone complains about this movement, and it's like, well, that's just because maybe you're not coaching it right, or you're not taking people through the steps to help them be able to do it safely and effectively. And no, we don't want to make it, snatches don't have to be a movement that we do every week, but it's not like we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Yep. I think that's a really good application of the theories that they discuss in this article.
Apparently, Gigi, I know we talked about this article, and Gigi was like, well, it's kind of like a duh. There's not really much to talk about.
But it is, it's all the concepts that we always talk about, right? Use it or lose it. You've got to do full range of motion and don't overdo it, right? Like, and that's the mantra, right? Like you have to move your body. You have to do these things. Just don't push yourself too hard, right? Like, and that Active Life, actually, for anyone who doesn't know, Active Life is a coaching company that does like an assess and correct, and they're very rehab and prehab oriented. And they talk about something where they talk about capacity, and your capacity on any given day is not necessarily just physical. It's also emotional and psychological as well. And that's where you would find that line of like overdoing it. Right. So if you had a really stressful week, or like maybe your spouse is out of town and you're watching the kids by yourself, and you had a really rough day at work, and then you go into the gym, your capacity that day is less than it normally would be. Right. And so just kind of going and doing the stuff and not pushing yourself too hard it sounds really kind of fluffy, but out there in the world, in the fitness world, there are different people that are putting out different things to further define this more and more as we learn more. And thankfully, the scientific community is backing all of this up, which is amazing, right? Because it's stuff that we've known anecdotally, but a lot of us are not really the academic-minded people to do a study.
Well, studies are expensive and they're limited, and they take a long time to get the results. And this is kind of what we talked about earlier with your own personal coach and kind of the decisions that you're trying to make. You don't always have to wait for the research to come in. If you just want to try. You're like, I think sweet potatoes kind of bother my stomach. I'm just going to not eat sweet potatoes for a few weeks and see how I feel. And that's true for my wife. She ate potatoes her whole life and then she realized that they give her a stomach ache, and so now she just doesn't eat sweet potatoes. She eats white potatoes; they're fine. And so doing these little experiments is important because, like I said, you don't have to wait for the research. Now, the research is part of the OODA loop, if you will. It is part of, like, we observe and orient ourselves according to some of the new research, and then we can make a change. And then you have to be careful because when we have multiple variables, if you change too much, you don't know which one's giving you the best results. So depending on your goals, you may not want to make a bunch of changes, and then you find out, years later after all this effort, well, 3 out of the 4 things you're doing aren't even doing anything for you. It's really just this one thing that was providing all the benefit. And that's where, again, experts in experimentation can help. One thing I will say about this study is a little bit of a criticism is at the end, they do say that the researchers suggest the results may lead to a whole new therapeutic approach known as a mechanomedicine, in which drugs stimulate the effects of mechanical forces to prevent the damaging effects of inflammation and treat conditions such as arthritis. So, of course, they're looking for a drug to give people to replicate this effect. Now, it's just like the obesity drug, or even like the male pill, right, to prevent pregnancy. Like, they've been chasing that dream for I don't know how long. If you're going to wait for this pill to come along, your joints are going to fall apart before it finally gets here. And again, there's so many other benefits to movement and activity that this one drug, isn't going to do, right? It might help their cartilage, and there probably will be some placebo effect, and someone's knees are hurting, and they take this drug, and then they're like, oh, my knees feel better, and it could be the drug, and probably has some benefit, but could be the placebo benefit. Where if you just actually just go for walks and still practice squatting full range of motion so that you can get off the toilet when you're 80, like those have far more reaching benefits than a pill you can take.
Well, the other thing that the pharmaceuticals tend to do, which is the same thing with the old way that the fitness industry used to operate, is that it focuses on one thing at a time, right? Mm-hmm. So like bodybuilding and stuff is like, okay, so we're going to build this specific muscle. We're going to isolate it and we're going to build it, which actually causes more harm than good, which we know now. But the thing with the pharmaceutical is that if it's like, great, it's going to do this specific thing, it's going to mimic this specific thing. We don't know enough about the body to know if that specific thing is enough to treat the problem itself, right? So we're going to come up with some kind of chemical that mimics the reaction with the villi and everything, and then, or the cilia or whatever it is. And then, but what about the blood flow? What about the oxygen to the cells? What about the mechanical impact? Like there's all kinds of other stuff that might have an impact, that this correlation causation, we don't know, right? We just don't know.
Yeah. And I just thinking out loud, like I hear that they have this drug that's going to activate this protein, but maybe that doesn't work if you don't have the blood flow that you get from mechanical motion, right? Or the operation of the muscles to help activate the lymph system, which is, which brings fluids away from tissues. And so it's like, okay, so again, you solve this one thing, but if you're not getting everything else, you don't get the benefit. And that's kind of what they're saying now about like fish oil, for example. It was the big thing. And they're saying that a lot of the longer term research is showing, well, it's maybe not this panacea that we thought it was. And it turns out that eating fish is what has the benefits, but just taking the fish oil by itself isn't as great as it originally seemed. They thought it was just the omega-3s. But it ends up being a lot more complicated than that. And so, it's like I said, though, you don't have to wait for the research to again, think about this stuff with from an ancestral model. Again, how did our human animals live before society really became a thing? And, how does this apply to my life? And how do I, what's sort of the general principle that they're kind of pointing toward. And like I said, it was a great article. And then you get to the end and then they're like, and now we're going to come up with a drug that's going to do this. And it's like, yeah, the body is as a system of systems. And you can't just piece out one little thing and expect to have these far reaching results. But, that's ultimately what they're trying to do. And that's where all the money is, right? If they can come up with a pill that solves this one problem and there's limited or no side effects, well, then they can sell that, till the cows come home. But yeah, when I wouldn't hold my breath.
All right, I think we're done for today.
That's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. This article is linked in the comments. Once again, like, share, subscribe. And if you have any more, like, especially if you have an article that you think is interesting or maybe goes against your beliefs and it really kind of rocked your world, or something that it seems complicated or could have big implications, send it our way and we will take a look at it, and maybe it'll show up as one of the topics of conversation for our podcast. So in the meantime, really think about having that mentor. Really think about finding somebody that you can refer to as an expert that can help you maintain your fitness or other goals, and don't rely on the mechanic to keep your car running great, for years and years without ever working on it. That's it for today, guys. Thanks a lot, and thrive on. Say bye, Gigi.
Bye.